Welcome to the Human Optimization Project, where we're creating the blueprint to help you become the best human you can be. I'm your guide and fellow optimizer, Christopher Camp. Today, we're going to be talking about cognitive overload, which is a term that I think can be worded in a lot of different ways, but when we hear it, we all sort of recognize it. I think we all deal with it and we struggle with it. So, we've titled this session Cognitive Overload: Overcoming the Modern Epidemic of Mental Exhaustion. To help us work through this today, we have Dr. Justin Anderson. Justin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Anderson is a nationally recognized high performance psychologist and the founder of Premier Sports Psychology, a firm specializing in optimizing performance mindsets and leadership. As CEO, Justin leads a team consulting with elite organizations, including teams from the NFL, the NBA, WNBA, Major League Baseball, Professional Women's Hockey League, the National Women's Soccer League, Team USA National Olympic teams, as well as corporate executive teams. He also directs Leadership U at the University of Minnesota, a program he designed to develop leadership and emotional intelligence for coaches and athletes. For over 20 years, Justin has shared insights on the performance mindset, thriving under pressure, resilience, and excellence through outlets like ESPN, the New York Times, and Athletic. So, Justin, I think you're pretty well positioned to help us tackle this today.
Well, I'm excited to talk about it. It's a cool topic, and one I think that we're facing quite a bit in today's world.
Yeah, I agree completely. So, to get us organized, we always like to start with our big three questions that we're going to try to work through. So, today, our first big question we're going to try to answer is what exactly is cognitive overload and what causes it? After that, we'll try to discuss the consequences of cognitive overload for everyday people in both their personal and professional lives. And then lastly, we'll take it home by describing the steps that we can take now to reduce cognitive overload and improve our mental performance. So that's the overview or the guide for today, and we might as well jump right in. So, Justin, I'll kick it off to you here. What exactly is cognitive overload, and why is it such a problem in our modern lives?
Yeah. So simply put, I think cognitive overload is really when the demands of our life exceed our mental capacity. And so what results is we have our working memory and our attention sort of gets overwhelmed. And it's a big issue today because we are just constantly exposed to information. I mean, our phones are really tied to our hips. We get notifications all the time, whether that's just our emails or our text message, but even social media, if a lot of people are on that. And then we have, I think, higher expectations today around multitasking and just productivity. Ultimately, we're in a stage of life where hard work and being busy is sort of a badge of honor. And so people are kind of in that rat race quite a bit. And then, quite honestly, with all that going on, in order for us to, sort of succeed or have some success in this world, we are working quite a bit, and we don't have as much time for recovery and reflection. And so, what that does then is it leads to poor decision making, reduces our focus, ultimately can lead to emotional burnout, and can affect really every area of our lives.
Yeah, and you mentioned burnout there too. I think it's important. I want to understand how does cognitive overload relate to burnout? Is it the same thing? Are they different? How do you distinguish?
Yeah, so there's kind of a couple different thoughts here on cognitive overload. One is there's this acute cognitive overload when we're in this temporary state of being just kind of overwhelmed with those demands, and this can happen in short term, and ultimately gets resolved with rest and relaxation. But then, if we are in a more chronic state of cognitive overload, then we tend to see burnout occur, and this really is. Where we're just getting fatigued. We don't really have the resources to continue to push or to continue to go, and so you start to see people lose a lot of motivation and drive for things that they were really interested in at one time.
So is it fair to say that burnout is really more of sort of a chronic issue of repetitive accumulated stress or accumulated cognitive overload over time?
Yes,
Okay.
that's fair to say.
All right. Well, let's focus today mostly on this more sort of short term or acute issue of
Yep.
cognitive overload. And tell me, what are some of the main causes, and specifically, Are they more or do you see that they're more professional in nature, like they tend to be related to our work lives, or are they more personal, meaning this is more of an issue that I'm having myself, or is it more relational, or all the above?
It is really all the above. I mean, it can hit us in every different space: professional, personal, and relational. And oftentimes, when we see people really get into an acute phase of overload, it's we're getting pinged on each one of those levels: the professional, the personal, and the relational. And that's when we start to see really poor decision making and the emotional components hit us in ways that we may not even recognize ourselves. Jung used to call, when we sort of got into this space, our shadow side would come out. And the shadow side, of course, is trying to protect us. It's trying to push any of these variables away as more of a defense mechanism.
And tell me, you work a lot. You do a lot of high level executive leadership coaching, and you also work with a lot of very elite level athletes and professional athletes. How do you see this show up in the professional athletes that you work with?
But it's a great question, and a lot of athletes, we talk about being clutch in high pressure situations. Oftentimes, these high pressure situations create a cognitive overload for us. The mind is racing quite a bit, and it's trying to gather and figure out which input it should attend to, and which ones it should let go of. And when we're in an elevated state of these high pressure moments, the mind races a little bit more and scans for threats more quickly and more often. And I'm in a relaxed state. The mind isn't scanning for threats as much. Now, if I hear a loud noise, boom, my mind will go to a potential threat. But in high pressure situations, we tend to see the mind getting into this cognitive overload place often. And that's why players often don't do very well in clutch situations. And there's sort of a misnomer that, like, Michael Jordan was great in clutch situations. Well, if you look at his free throw percentage shooting in clutch situations, it was less than what his free throw percentage was in normal game non-pressure situations or high pressure situations. And so even he had a little bit of a drop due to what some would call this cognitive overload, just taking in too much information, and that can activate the body. So we see this show up all the time for all of us, but particularly for athletes. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about what they do and how they train to do this. But we see this with special forces too. Getting into spaces, and so they do a lot of training in situations where there's a lot of cognitive information and overload happening, so they can train the mind to hold their attention to the variables that are most important during those times. And that is one of the tools that we will use often and over again in training the mind to get through some of these high pressure situations.
I've never been on national TV trying to hit a three pointer to win a game. And I don't very often find myself in combat situations. But, what you're describing, though, I think I still hear that. I feel that, even though my life is obviously very different than an elite athlete or anybody in special forces. So, would you say for the average or everyday person that really the story is kind of similar, even though the circumstances may be a little bit different?
Yeah, yeah, we're facing that all the time. I mean, we are performing day in and day out, and whether that's at work or at home. But you think about just here was my morning, getting up, getting the kids ready, getting them out the door, getting my day scheduled, all set up, talking to a number of people on the way into the office, getting prep for this podcast, and all of a sudden you start to think, just that morning there were multiple things coming at me. Kids, as many of us know who have kids, they're always unpredictable, and you never really know what kind of information you're going to be getting from them. So you hope that they're going to be hitting the markers and the time marks, so we can get out the door on time and get to the office and get to the meetings in time. But we're constantly juggling. How are we going to take in this information, and how do we juggle it all? From parents to working with our office workers, and students cramming for tests. So I mean, it does hit us all the time.
Yeah. So speaking of juggling that information, I recently saw that the average person says roughly 16,000 words in a day and makes something like 35,000 decisions over the course of the day. It's unbelievable how much information comes into us and then how much we have to process and then send back out. And I think one of our common strategies for trying to do this is some of it we bury down and ignore, but we often try to deal with it by multitasking, and we're trying to manage multiple things at once. Does that help or hurt our cognitive overload in the long run?
It ultimately hurts it because a lot of times when we switch our task, we're getting bombarded with all the information of that task. And if we haven't completed the first task, then that's still sort of hanging in our working memory and other processing parts of our brains. And so we're still sort of dealing with that, and then we're dealing with this. And so ultimately, it can really cost a lot more energy for us. We talk about this being a switching cost in terms of multitasking. And so we see a lot of people deal with trying to get all this information, as you talked about, potentially making so many decisions a day. We talk about decision overload or decision fatigue a lot. That's a term that comes up with a lot of leaders in today's world. And really, what that is I have so many things coming at me. How do I synthesize and work through all of that? And so, a lot of leaders are putting prioritization in terms of which decisions are they going to hold on to and work through, and which ones are they going to leave for another time. But that requires organization, that requires intentionality, and then ultimately that requires an ability to not check the text message or the phone or the notification that comes in while you're doing what you're doing.
And we talk about how a lot of these different domains are connected. So here in the Human Optimization Project, it's not all about just the mental performance. It's also about how do we pull in sleep and exercise, nutrition, relationships, and stress management. How do all those things relate? So in this area of cognitive overload, how do the things like sleep and exercise, nutrition, and our relationships impact our ability to process this information and handle it?
Yeah, it's critical, and it's one of those things that if we can get and sleep may be the most important of all those. Although all of those are important, but we're finding just the benefits of sleep. One for keeping the mind sort of recovered and replenished. There's tremendous effects on that from a recovery standpoint. But we also know now that the mind is kind of cleaning itself and it's clearing some of the clutter away, and it allows for more efficiency to happen when we're dealing with this information that's coming to us. And so one thing we talk about, and athletes, especially younger athletes or younger people in general, sort of minimize the importance of sleep. They think, "Ah, I don't need it, I don't need as much of it, I can get by on X, Y, and Z." And so they'll stay up later playing games or video games, or scrolling through their phones, the endless scroll, and they're not sleeping as much. And what we're seeing then is a significant impact on their ability to handle this cognitive acute and chronic overload. And then what results is poorer mental health overall. That can really impact us in the long run, and other health factors as well. But you talked about what's the importance of sleep and exercise and nutrition and managing our stress. I mean, I think one of the things that we talk about in the work we do with the athletes and with executives, we talk about a stress threshold. We all have a threshold that when we cross it, we're not optimal. One thing we talk about a lot is self-discovery. Where is that line for me? Where is that threshold? And one thing we know is if I get good sleep, good exercise, nutrition, I can increase my stress threshold. I can handle more stress throughout the day. If I get lower sleep, or let's say I'm just hangry, that's my nutrition, my blood sugar, or whatever. You know more about that, doc, than I would. But that affects me. And now the next thing that comes, I'm bothered by it, and I might be more reactive to it. And that's again just psychologically, I'm pushing things away from me because I can't handle subconsciously another thing that might put me over my threshold. So a lot of times, what we talk about, one of the executives I was working with, he talked about once he went through this discovery, CEO for a large company, he started to name before his meetings where he was on his stress continuum so that his senior leadership team would sort of know how to calibrate themselves to where he was at. And so he's like, I'm at my threshold. And so then they would sort of adjust how they were talking or what sort of things they would throw in front of him. But it was a really interesting way. I thought it was a very wise way, especially when you had a very trusting team,
Mhm.
so they could all sort of calibrate where each other was. And then they also understood that if he was pushing back or reactive, he might be over his threshold and might not be thinking as clear as he had been or could be, if he was underneath that stress threshold.
That's great. I just see people in the meeting say, "All right, let's not ask for the salary increase today. Thresholds. Okay, wait till the threshold's above a 9 before we pop that one out." Yeah, but that's great. I mean, that's incredible communication, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But I think that all of these things can be either positive feedback loops or negative feedback loops, right? So if you take you mentioned sleep as being one of them. If your sleep is poor, you're more prone to cognitive overload. If you get cognitive overload, you're going to struggle with your sleep, and so it becomes this negative cycle. And maybe we can flip that and make them both positive and be synergistic with one another.
That's spot on.
And a lot of the things you mentioned that contribute to cognitive overload for us. Expectations are high. We're constantly connected now. You mentioned video games, all of this. So a lot of these are modern phenomenon. Do you think this problem of cognitive overload is it a modern problem, or is this something that we've always struggled with as human beings?
I think we've always struggled with it, just in different ways. I mean, I think you look at different times, it may not be dealing with sort of this information overload, but we might have been struggling with survival tasks. How am I going to get food on the table? And the mind then is searching and going through all these scenarios. So I think we've always had it, and because of that, we've sort of had this defined defense mechanisms, as we kind of brought up a number of times. When we get past that threshold, we see that, and then human behavior hasn't been great in certain periods of our time. So I think we've had it forever. I think it's just the way it's hitting us and how it's hitting us that's different. And modern time, we are bombarded with just a lot. Like the information age. We just have so much information coming our way that it is presenting unique challenges that I think mankind hasn't had to deal with. It's just been different cognitive overload in the past.
Well, and speaking of that, so unique challenges and different forms of cognitive overload, do you feel like certain types of people or maybe certain careers are more prone to experience cognitive overload? Or is it universal and that certain careers just get a different type of it? How would you sort through that?
Well, I mean, so here's the thing. I think everybody experiences cognitive overload, but I do find that there are certain types of personalities that tend to, I think, experience it maybe a little bit differently. And we talk a lot about like type A personalities and contemporary psychology. But I mean, really, what that is that it's people that tend to want to be more perfect in everything that they do. So perfectionists. A lot of athletes at the highest levels are perfectionists. They really strive to get things right. And it's been one of the things that drove them, motivated them to get to the highest level. I think you probably see in your profession, Doc, a lot of doctors probably as perfectionists and really drive. It is a sort of high level for successful people tend to do that. Now, on one end, I say it's been beneficial to you because it's driven a lot of folks to that level. On the second point, though, is that the thing that got us here sometimes can be the thing that prevents us from going further. And so we do tend to work with a lot of perfectionists because they tend to overthink, and that increases the cognitive overload. They're constantly trying to problem solve. Where somebody who's a little more laissez-faire, go with the flow, sort of in the calmer state, they might just be good enough. That's good enough. Let's just keep going, and they may not experience as much of the cognitive overload. But on the other hand, I do see highly empathetic people as well. So those nurturers, those caregivers, if their people around them aren't doing well, they sort of absorb that emotion, and so they can get overloaded by kind of feeling for the people around them, particularly when others are in distress. So we do see those two types of personalities uh, tend to feel this, or I'll just say this anecdotally. I work with those folks a lot on cognitive overload, and it tends to be those types of personalities. And then getting into the job part, I would say we see a lot of people who are in high stakes jobs, like surgeons, teachers, a lot of time dealing with a lot of people, first responders, athletes, people who are in high pressure situations tend to do that. And then, I think the other part is you see people by the situation. So parents, young parents, dealing with children for the first times, going through transitions, dealing with perhaps elderly people, family members, and caring for them. Those types of things can create sort of this cognitive overload, or what I call is it just gets that stress level already really close to that threshold, and then really any curveball that comes their way, it puts them over that, and now their mental capacity can't handle the demands that are coming at them.
Yeah, I think it's very well worded too, and I think that we tend to think about it as being attached to certain jobs, but in reality, sort of what you just laid out there is that it's a combination, sort of your professional responsibility and obligation, your personal kind of personality makeup, and your stress threshold, and the relationship. So it's, as you mentioned earlier, those three components, really all three of them kind of contributing collectively.
Exactly. And that's why I think all of us will experience cognitive overload from time to time, and often many of us probably quite frequently. And so it is a common problem a lot of us are trying to manage.
Yeah, and I think we've all been there, or at least tasted it. And I'd like to sort of transition to our next section where we talk a little bit more about the consequences of it. So, can you tell me what are some of the key cognitive functions that you've noticed that can be impacted by cognitive overload?
Yeah. So certainly working memory. So our ability to sort of hold information happens. And so we sort of get more disorganized quite often. If you're forgetting where you just put something, there's a chance that your mind is sort of managing a lot of different things. We also see attention. And one thing we're working on a lot here at Premier Sports Psychology is helping individuals, both executives, but also athletes. A lot of the NFL quarterbacks I work with, it's really about attention. Where do they put their attention? Because that's a behavioral thing we can train. And a lot of us aren't really aware of where we're putting it. And it's an incredibly valuable resource. And if we get that right, decision making, processing speed, all of those things can also fall out of that tree. But those are the things, working memory, attention. But then if we're overloaded, then it does in fact impact our decision making. It impacts how quickly we can solve some of these problems, and then ultimately it can impact memory encoding as well as retrieval. So if I'm in a cognitively overload place, I am not going to pick up the playbook as quickly or as efficiently, or if I'm studying for an exam or some other key thing, I will not encode that information well. So we always talk about with the NFL teams we work with, how do we help their players get into a very relaxed and nurturing, sort of comfortable space when they're starting to go through film and or studying their playbook. And so we're doing a lot of things not to juice them before we're going to teach them, which has sort of been the old model of pro sports and football specifically. No, no, no. We want to get them into a comfortable, a digestive space where their minds can really take that information and encode it efficiently, because then we know that if it's encoded well, then we can retrieve it more quickly. But if I'm in a cognitive overload place, it's going to be hard to retrieve that too. So we do want to practice retrieval in higher pressure situations so that we can learn how to retrieve this information while the mind is sort of spinning or racing, which often happens in these high pressure situations.
Oh, so huge implications for sort of higher level executive function, memory, decision making. What about the creative side? Are doing artistic work, creative type work? How does it impact that?
Yeah, it certainly impacts that. I mean, we talk a lot about authors, writers who are under a time crunch. Oftentimes, they don't produce very good work. So it does impact cognitive flexibility. Again, one way to describe this is when we're in a cognitive overload, our brains are in a more of a fight or flight space. And what that does is it's not going to allow us to think as creatively. It's going to try to lock in on certain things. So we get a little bit more fixed mindset. And so creative thinking becomes we less divergent thinking, and it reduces the capacity for us to get more creative.
And along those lines too, in addition to being creative, what about sort of our emotional health and our ability to be social and have healthy interactions and relationships with other people?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I'm in a cognitive overload place, I am going to get into that more defensive spot. And when I'm in a more defensive place, I lower my empathy for others. And so that's a fascinating phenomenon we might be seeing in our cultures today is really maybe less empathy for others, and more focus on how is this serving me. And again, if I'm in a cognitive overloaded place, the body believes it's in a deficit. It does not have enough capacity to handle the demands around it. So it's going to try to soak in and get more. And of course, when we're in relationships and we're pulling for more for ourselves, that often doesn't lead well as a leader in a partnership or a marriage. It does not lend well for those relational components. And then, of course, when we're in that cycle, as you talked about earlier, Doc, you get into a spot where I'm needing more, and so then I'm actually driving others away, and then I don't get the thing that I'm needing. And so I get into this negative cycle very often with the cognitive overload. So we do want to get to some of those tools that we can use to get myself back into a less of a deficit place and able to give and pour out. Because then when we pour out to others, we often feel much better ourselves. And then it comes back to us.
It's fantastic. I mean, it is very hard to pour into others when your cup is empty, and that could be a very negative synergy when that happens for sure. Let's talk a little bit about how we've mostly talked about sort of acute or short term things. Take me through the process. How does this become a chronic problem and end up contributing to burnout long term?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think if we're in a prolonged state, cognitive overload, or what we talk a lot about here is in distress. We tend to see our mental health decline, and that chronic stress can lead to higher levels of anxiety and higher levels of depression, which we're seeing, across the board, and really every kind of state of population right now, from youth to senior citizens. And so, it is a mental health epidemic. And Surgeon General came out for a couple of years ago talking about our youth and mental health. And so, part of that might be due to a lot of this cognitive overload with the information that's coming to them, the demands that are being asked of our young people, and then the lack of coping strategies. But long-term effects, mental health, we do tend to see cognitive decline. So people have a much harder time with memory and problem-solving abilities. As you mentioned, burnout is a key piece. We start to lose enthusiasm for things that we tended to like. So we see a lot of athletes go through this if they're in a cognitive overload state for a while, and then just emotionally exhausted. And their productivity goes down, and they often detach. So we start to see people sort of moving away from the groups that they once were really engaged in. And so that's a sign that we look at, but also physical health. The chronic stress. We one thing we're doing with an NBA team we're working with is we're looking at stress levels. And we're doing that through HRV, heart rate variability, but we're testing the guys in getting their baseline. And then we're seeing, geez, when they're at a lower heart rate variability level, we tend to know that their stress levels are higher. And when their stress levels are higher, they're more prone to get injured. And so we start to see some of these things happening. But then that can also impact pain, recovery, and then sleep issues occur with this. And so ultimately, it can impact a lot of things, from relationships, as we talked about, to career. And then, what people do is they tend to use supplements to kind of cope. And so that could be I got to wind down with a glass of wine or alcohol or marijuana, or boy, I need to spark up because I'm so cognitively fatigued, and so get my coffee going, and I'm guilty of that. But so then you start to see people begin to play with different things to change that that cycle a little bit.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about the negative consequences of cognitive overload. And honestly, we've covered a lot, but I think that we're still, that's just the tip of the iceberg. It is a pretty exhaustive list. But I want to be well rounded here on the human optimization projects. Are there any benefits to cognitive overload? Maybe not, but I always like to ask.
Yeah, there really is, and we see this because if it's kind of like strength training, right? If I stress the body appropriate amount of times, I can get stronger, and we know this about our brains as well. If we stress our brains in appropriate times, and we learn from it, that's a key piece, sort of this reflection and understanding what was working for me there, what was I doing in those spaces, and then how can I handle that differently or better the next time I'm stressed like that. But we can stress our brains, and if we stress our brains, we can grow from that. So there is some things that can grow from that. The other part is, we talked about the issue with creativity going down. There is some benefits we're seeing with being stressed like that, and then sort of figuring out what I've done. We do see some people sort of realize, I can get through something, or I can have this breakthrough that I didn't think I was capable of doing. And so we do see people tend to, again, sort of appropriately train the cognitive overload. We do see some creative breakthroughs and/or performance breakthroughs. And then, as we alluded to earlier, we do help a lot of and set up training regimens for athletes to perform under pressure. So, during the practices, it's very common now for teams to be blasting loud music during the practices to simulate what the pressure will feel like in a stadium with 70,000 fans screaming at it. So, how do I communicate? How do I deal with that? But that's just another form of information that's bombarding our minds, and so we have to sort of tune that out and stay focused on what I'm doing. But ultimately, what it can do, I think, if you're picking up what I'm trying to put down here, is it can lead to a more resilient mind. So we're getting into a more resilient space.
Well, this is great. I think it's a great transition into our last section where I want to talk a little bit about the steps we can take to actually reduce cognitive overload. And I love the analogy of strength training. You lift heavier weights to increase strength, and if you continue to lift lighter and lighter weights, you're not going to get stronger, or at least not as efficiently as you could if you lift heavy. And in fact, I would say the only way to really tell how strong somebody is physically is to keep going until you can't lift a certain weight. And then that was too much for you. Which I think is a good analogy, but also can be dangerous a little bit, when we're talking about it for cognitive functions. And one of the things I think about, I love the analogy, but one of the areas where we have to be intentional about describing it is that if let's say you and I are working out and we're weight training, we're very intentional and thoughtful about how much weight we put on the bar before we try to lift it. And there's usually a process. We don't start at 800 pounds. We
Right.
we we start light and we slowly add it up based on what we can tolerate. And I think one of the issues for our cognitive load is that much of it is not intentionally applied to our minds like the weight is when we're putting it on the bar. And so much of it is this stuff that's coming at us that we feel like we can't really control. And so it's almost the equivalent of like I'm working out and random people are walking by and putting weights on the bar and I don't know that they're doing it. That's almost sort of the life that we live there. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about how we overcome that and how we fix that. So
Yeah.
my first question here is, first, who is responsible for my cognitive overload? Is this something that falls on me, or is this the responsibility of my organization or my significant other, or is it shared? How do you view that?
Yeah. Ultimately, in these types of situations, I want to give agency to personal responsibility more than maybe anything else. And we can get into organizations and sort of what are their responsibilities, what are leaders' responsibilities to create psychological safety and probably help some of this stuff. But really, when we're talking about organizational responsibility, I'm trying to help. How do I help my people become more have less clutter so they can be as productive and in a less stress threshold or pass their threshold so that they can be their best selves because culture is improved, relationships are communications improved, all those things. So from a cultural or organizational standpoint, they do want to do that and help with cognitive overload because it can help with everything that they're trying to accomplish as an organization. But ultimately, when it comes to, I think most listeners here and people that I see, I want to give agency back to the person. And so ultimately I say it is up to you to manage sort of what you're intaking, build your threshold, be thoughtful about sort of your boundaries and your habits, and not wait. Here's the one thing that I find for so many people and organizations is too. They wait until they're past the threshold and then they try to figure something out. And I'm like, no, no, it's kind of like that'd be like waiting for a heart attack to happen and then doing something about it. We wanna we want to begin to think through how we're going to manage some of these demands on our lives and be intentional about it. But I believe it is a personal responsibility to do that because we can ultimately control what we're attending to, what we perceive that that issue or that variable to be. And there's a ton of science, and this is probably for another podcast around my perception of the stress
Mm.
is more important than the actual stressor. So how we believe that is. Am I excited or is this a very stressful time? That perception can be a huge thing. So, but we want to train that stuff. And I think the personal responsibility is where we can control it the most. And so we go after that.
Great. Well, what should people do and where do we start? Should we start at trying to raise our stress threshold, as you mentioned earlier, or should we try to reduce the amount of input that's coming in that's overwhelming us? Or do we work on both simultaneously?
Yeah, I'd really work on both simultaneously, and I think that's the stress threshold. I mean, I think those are just good, healthy habits that I think we know a lot about. But it is that importance of sleep. It is looking at what we put in, and then the one thing I would also add to that is doing some self discovery. We call it in emotional intelligence, we call it self awareness, but it is really starting to understand where am I on that threshold and then what are some of these variables that I kind of get bombarded with daily that might put me over it? And then how am I handling those things? So we often get into situations where same variables will hit us daily. We kind of get in this rut of doing what we do, and so you can start to, if you be mindful of it, you can start to be paying attention to what sort of things are going to hit you, and then have a plan for it. And we often talk about being proactive in that plan is far better. It's kind of like a quarterback. I don't want him thinking about how to handle the interception when he's going through the emotional frustration of throwing an interception. I want him having a plan prior to that so that now when the interception happens, he just does this. And if he does that, then he's going to get through it faster and better. If he's trying to figure out how do I handle this and oh gosh, what am I going to do? And oh my, I'm thinking about what coaches, what the crowd is, who am I letting down with the score? Holy crap. I'm now overloaded. And the next series that I go out, I'm going to be worthless. But if I'm like, yep, I knew, that's a good chance of those things happening. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do my deep breathing. I'm going to let that go. I'm going to maybe voice my frustration. Yeah, I'm frustrated. I'm angry. I'm sad. Whatever it is I'm feeling, the emotion I'm feeling. And then what do I want to do now? Get that attention back to the thing that I want. I want to get back in my sets. I want to see okay, where the routes are going to be. I want to get into that, and so get back into what we want to do. But sorry for kind of belaboring that question or answer, but I think you want to do both,
Mm.
and that's looking at how do I decrease some of this input, and then how do I increase that stress threshold. Or that.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And pulling together a couple things you've said when we talk about decreasing the input, you also said we can't always control the things that are happening outside of us or that are coming into us, but we can control what we give our attention to. Do you think is that the key for decreasing the input? Because I may not be able to control how many questions people ask me or what is demanded of me or the circumstances going on outside of my life, but I can control where I give my attention. Elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a really powerful one, and it's one that we use a ton with really all our executives and leaders and elite athletes. And it really the attention. We talk about our mindsets, the different components that go into our mindset. And at Premier, we talk about our attention, or our focus, our thoughts, our emotions, our body sensations, kind of how we're feeling, and then our behaviors. And the two things that are the most controllable in that mindset are our attention, where we're putting our attention, and our behaviors. So oftentimes we think and we teach what behaviors will actually put my attention on the behavior that I want. And if I do that, it will start to have an effect on what I think, how I feel emotionally and physically. And so we talk about putting our behaviors first and acting and doing the things that we want to do that live in accordance to our values versus sort of reacting to some of these things that come our way. But having said that, it's impossible to handle all the curveballs that come our ways. And so what we can do though is we can start to begin get intentional, and that's being very mindful of where am I putting my intention, and being a master in bringing your attention back to what you want to in any given moment. And that's being present. That could be going internal when there's chaos, external. I always say the oasis can be here if there's chaos there. Or it can be diving into a present moment and being really connected to the person that you're talking to in a conversation, or the meal you're having, or some a sensation that you're doing there. Watch what happens when you get very present. And if next meal you have, here's a simple tool that we use: do a mindful eat. So sit down and actually, instead of kind of throwing stuff through us and getting on to our next task, or even watching the TV or whatever you're doing while you're eating, just pay attention to the smells, the texture, the taste. We did this with a NHL team. We just put a Starburst right in front of them, and we had it sit there for a while. And then we did a mindfulness thing with that, and they just got to look at it. They got to feel the texture, the waxy paper. They started to smell it, and once by the time they put it in their mouth, I mean, a lot of them were like, "Holy cow! I had no idea my mouth was watering before." They weren't aware that their mouth was watering, and a lot of them are like, "This is the best dang starburst I've ever had in my life." And so, just by simply doing a tool of directing our attention to something, we can get so much more out of life, and it can recharge us. So, it paying attention to that, our attention is really a great tool.
Well, I think that's phenomenal, and you highlighted there how you can pay more attention to the good things or the positive things, or you can find the positive in what you're experiencing. And I think on the flip side, you could also start to pay less attention to the things that you don't have any control over. The Stoics talk about the dichotomy of control, with you sort of separate everything to things I have control over and things I don't have control over. And everything you don't have control over, you just accept and move on. There's no point in dwelling on it if you can't change it. So I think trying to not give your attention to things you can't control, or maybe that are negative, and then really hyper focusing that positive attention on the ones you can control can be huge.
Huge.
Well, tell me, what are some, as we start to wrap up here, what are some of the benefits I could expect in my life if I do a better job, if I can control the inputs or start paying attention, be better at paying attention to the things I should in a positive way. And then secondly, also increase my stress threshold. What benefits should I expect?
Well, I think, in a relatively quick period of time, you will see some cognitive benefits just from our improved focus. Our memory will pick up, but you'll notice a better decision making as well. And then you'll notice also probably reduce stress, so emotional benefits, reduce stress, and a better emotional regulation. I won't get triggered or angry or irritable as quickly, and so a lot of times that can be an indicator for us that I'm doing things. But then you get physical benefits. Usually, as we talked about, better sleep, increased energy. And then you can also see better productivity in our professional lives. So you start to see, gosh, because I'm clearer thinking, I'm more productive, I can get things done faster and more efficiently, and maybe better quality. And then the social benefits. I think the final one is we often tend to see when I'm past that below my threshold, stress threshold, and not cognitively overloaded, that I can form deeper connections and have more empathy for the people that are around me.
Great. Well, I've been taking notes as we've been working through this. So I'm going to highlight just a couple of things I pulled out of my notes, and I'll give you a chance to summarize as well. But the big take homes for me were that the sources of cognitive overload are not just professional or from your career or working job, but also personal and relational. And I think that those three can be additive to one another in a positive or negative direction, which is incredibly helpful. I also like thinking about this concept of trying to raise your stress threshold while also decreasing the input mainly by controlling what you give your attention to. And if it's not helpful to pay attention to it, then you shouldn't. Or if you can't control it, then you shouldn't. If you should pay attention to it and you need to, then doing it in a very thoughtful, intentional, and deliberate way. And also, I've always sort of known about the impact on executive function in terms of making decisions and memory and all of that that cognitive overload could have. But I think you did a great job of highlighting that this affects not only our executive function, but also our creative work, our artistic work, our emotional health, and our interpersonal relationships as well. So that was all fantastic. So we started with three big questions. So I'm going to run through those real quickly and give you a chance to answer each of them specifically. So our first big question: what exactly is cognitive overload and what causes it?
Yeah, again, cognitive overload happens when our mental demands are exceeding sort of our ability to manage it, or exceeding our ability to cope, and that impacts working memory and attention capacities.
And what are the consequences of cognitive overload for everyday people in their personal and professional lives?
I mean, it can impact our cognitive abilities. It can impact our emotional abilities, emotional regulation. It can impact our relationships, and ultimately can impact our careers and our professional lives.
And what steps can we take right now to reduce cognitive overload and improve our mental performance?
I think you said it really well. I mean, I think we can reduce our input by really being clear in prioritizing where we want to put our attention, setting some boundaries for that attention, in practicing managing those distractions. When I do get distracted, can I bring it back? And then I increase my capacity, my stress threshold, or my ability to handle some of these cognitive demands by practicing mindfulness, being present moment, exercise, sleep, and good nutrition.
Excellent. Well, we always like to give a challenge to our audience to try to put this into play and actually take the first steps on their journey to minimizing their cognitive overload. So, one of the thoughts I had that I think would be really helpful for folks. This is a quick and easy one. Go into your phone. Turn off all essential notifications. Ask yourself, do you really need the banners and badges to pop up with every email, every text message, every like, every comment? Probably not. And every one of those is a huge distraction for you. So I would encourage you, go in, turn all of them off, or at least as many as you can practically. And then, Justin, we talked a little bit about being intentional and planning out your day. What are your thoughts? What would be your call to action for folks to try to be proactive in determining what they're going to give their attention to for that day?
Yeah, one tool I use with a lot of the athletes is just setting the intention in the morning. So it takes no more than 5 minutes. And one of the things that we do is just as you're waking up, or I do it, I just get down into a little workout space I have, and I start to do some breathing. But start with setting the intention for the day, and it's just sort of, where is my mind today? What do I have in front of me? And then how do I want to manage it? And just a simple three-step process of sort of setting that intention for the day can really go a long ways to help direct your attention when you get into the chaos.
I love it. So, optimizers, turn your phone notifications off today, and then tomorrow morning when you get up, take a little minute, set the intention for the day, decide what you're going to pay attention to. There you have it. Dr. Justin Anderson did a phenomenal job walking us through this session. The title is Cognitive Overload: Overcoming the Modern Epidemic of Mental Exhaustion. So it's a huge concept, a lot of value and take home points that affects our everyday lives. Thank you, Justin, for sharing your experience and wisdom with us today.
Thank you. It's great being with you.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us. As always, remember to live intentionally, consistently better. Keep striving to be the best human you can be and never stop optimizing.